Engagers, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of using games and gamification in our daily lives, for example, to learn what we are teaching. And I am Rob Alvarez. I work at Ironhack, teach at IE Business School University, and so much more, and host this podcast. If you have an extra second, please go ahead and subscribe for free to our email list at professorgame.com/subscribe. Hey, Engagers, welcome back to this episode of the Professor Game podcast. And we are today with Francois. But Francois, before we kick off, are you prepared to engage?
I should be, yeah. I feel prepared.
Let's do this. Let's go. Because François, and I hope I'm pronouncing that decently, Boucher-Genesse, is that okay?
Yeah, totally correct. Yeah.
He started his career in the AAA video game industry as a game designer. And after his first big release in 2008, he started academic studies to determine how to best use games' potential as learning tools. The results were so promising that he founded the Ululab, which is a company that creates games designed to change intuitions on hard-to-learn subjects. And that is creating truly enjoyable educational games and has been his focus for the past 13 years to this date. Is there anything that you'd like to add to that intro?
No, I guess just writing this, I'm now realizing it's been a while, but it still is my ongoing mission, right? And I still feel there's a lot to be learned in that field, and so yeah, it's still exciting to be there, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Absolutely exciting, definitely is. And can you tell us, what is a regular day, regular week? What does being Francois, in these days look like?
Yeah, for sure. So the answer will really differ now than it used to be for the past 13 years, I guess, for me. So now it's mostly managing a company, right? And so making sure no one in the team is blocked. We're a team of about 8 people. And so, everyday life is meeting, and when I'm lucky, a little bit of development, because I'm still emotionally attached to improving the game where I can. But the team is doing the grunt of the work here. In the past, I guess that has been the case for like the past year or 2 years that the team grew. But, the 13 years that you mentioned earlier, most of my day-to-day job was trying to figure out just how to change players' intuitions through games and game mechanics specifically, and really focusing on that. So it was a really different type of experience. It's mostly, playtests, really different type of day, right? So playtest, coding, and trying to figure out basically a new type of game that doesn't, it exists in the market, but isn't a significant share of it yet. And so I feel like it can really grow. And it's been a challenge just because there's not a lot of examples to look at out there, right? So yeah, so that was my day before, and now it's more management, basically.
So you're still sneaking in some design every now and then, yes, but it's not the usual anymore.
If I can.
And talking about, the things that you're doing and all that history, all that time that you've been doing this, I'm sure there's plenty of stories, plenty of times that you could discuss about, but we would like to go to one of those sort of fail moments, those first attempts in learning, failure moments, your favorite fail, however you want to call it, because we want to be there, in that story, in the ground, listening to the lessons, how you came out of it, what did you learn from that? We want to sort of be there with you.
Yeah, for sure. So the interesting part is, as soon as I hear this question, I immediately think about an entire game that we tried to make that didn't work out. And that was a game about animals and ecosystems and really complex systems, right? So I think I mentioned in the description, we're basically trying to tackle hard problems and problems that people have misconceptions about, right? So their intuition isn't entirely right about a particular subject. And so for that, you need complex subjects. And so animals and ecosystems and just nature in general is pretty complex, right? And so it seems like a perfect fit for an educational game. So basically the SimCity of nature, if you will, right? We basically were stuck in prototyping for the entire duration of the project. We just could never find a good way to, or good gameplay mechanic that would really highlight and make you think through the educational parts of it, right? And so the big problem we had was that players, we we were able to simulate nature and ecosystems and animals and even evolution a little bit, right? And we were able to have basically an ecosystem out there that was more like a simulator, but we just never could figure out where to introduce players without breaking the educational value of the game. Because nature just acts on its own, right? There is no point at which humans just come in and say, hey, we're going to change this and see what happens. It happens in real life, but if you want to make players understand how nature and evolutions work, player agency is really hard to introduce in there. So that was a really hard lesson and a hard part of Ululab history in our case. But the lesson there for me, I think, was that you really have to pick your subject carefully, and not all subjects are compatible with a game-based approach, right? And so maybe in that case, it would have been more of a simulation, because as we were doing the simulation and as we were building a game, I learned a lot about the way that nature works and ecosystems work just by being exposed to that simulator, right? And I'm sure the educational potential is there, but to do an actual game with gameplay mechanics, it's not all subjects that are compatible with it. And I believe there's a really good reason why we haven't seen a nature SimCity yet out there in the market, right? So we found out the hard way, but there was a good lesson out of it.
So if you were going to approach this once again, or something along those lines, how would you sort of, I don't know, I'm sure that you've now identified different ways of finding those red flags or those things that say, look, this is not real material for an educational game, perhaps, or you're way off target, and let's either kick it to the curb or do something else, or completely restart the approach. How do you go about it nowadays? Yeah.
So I think there's two sides of it. I guess what I was talking about was mostly finding subjects that were compatible with a game-based approach, right? And there are two ways in which you can not be. The first one, I think, would just be, is the subject just too simple, right? Because you don't want to invest the time and energy in making game learning experience, at least not the way we're doing it, which we can go a little bit in details a little bit later. But you don't want to invest all of that time for a subject that can just be memorized or is just too simple to showcase, right? So the way that we're doing it is we're trying to make sure that the game mechanics are teaching you a system. And if the system is really simple, then the game mechanics are going to be really simple and you're not going to really have fun playing the game, right? So that's the first aspect. It's really easy to just say, don't do multiplication tables with a game, because that's just rote memory and there's not a whole lot of system to take out of it, right? But yeah, the other side of it is the game that I mentioned that we, the animals simulation. I guess for that one, you need to do prototyping. And in our case, the way we would approach it differently now is we actually had a budget to do prototyping in there. And so we were kind of incentivized to keep going, right? But the way I would do it differently now is just definitely whenever I see the first signs of, okay, we're not quite sure what players will do in the game, right? And if we can't figure that out in just a few weeks, right? I would just cut the project right away and or at least try a radically different approach, right? And so the lesson there is, I think for the second part of it, you have to try it, but just manage your time better, right? And that was just, that's what I would do differently.
It sort of cut your losses earlier, which is really hard, right?
Yeah, it's always hard to know if a prototype fails. It's hard to know it's because the prototype wasn't good or because there's just nothing there, right? You're basically taking shots in the dark and you don't know if you're just passing right next to something that's really promising, right? And so it's a hard skill for sure to prototype.
Yeah, because one thing is pivoting and another thing is completely dropping the project and moving on. So exactly. That choice is really hard.
To be frank, there's a good community of game developers here in Montreal, right? And no one that I know of has found the perfect solution for that, and even just for regular games, right? So it's a challenge no matter what. It just turns out that educational games, in my experience at least, have less examples to draw from, right? And so it's really hard to, it's even harder, if anything, to know when to stop.
Gotcha. Interesting. And at least it is putting us in the mindset of, every now and then it is a thing to sort of pivot and see if some things are working, some things are not. But, every now and then we also have to, do a rain check and say, look, is this ever going to work? Does it make sense to continue investing here and make choices? So that's a really, really important lesson as well to be learned the hard way many times.
I guess so, yeah. But we felt so good after stopping the project that I think we'll make that call earlier now, knowing that. Yes,
for sure. So taking it in a 180-degree spin. Mm-hmm. So instead of going for a difficult moment, actually going for a successful one or something that you were sort of a success story, a proud moment. We would like to be there with, one of those projects that actually did go your way and know maybe success factors, and again, be there in that story with you.
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy that there was more on that than the the previous one, right? So I guess the main thing for me professionally, right, has been after having done games and just regular entertaining games, right? The biggest question for me was, okay, well, how, I know that you can learn through games, that you basically learn, all games are educational to a point, right? Like you learn the game mechanics most of the time just naturally without even realizing it. And so I knew about the learning potential, but I didn't know how to apply it to subjects that we would consider quote unquote more educational, right? So physics, mathematics, and et cetera. And so the first big challenge for me was to figure out how to do that properly. And so that's why I went back in Quebec and started a master's in education to just read about the research in that field and trying to figure it out. And the main consensus I was seeing out of the research was to focus on integrating the learning matter with the game mechanics themselves, because players are focused on game mechanics, right? Like that's what they want to learn. That's where they focus their time and effort on. And so if you put learning material outside of that, they might look at it, but it won't be as, center of attention for them, right? So I think the answer to that for me at least was A, just make sure that the subject is well integrated, and B, find subjects that lend themselves well to educational games, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And so the first outcome of the master in education was a game about a really hard subject, which is Newtonian physics, right? So learning about things like why when you drop two objects of different mass, why do they fall to the ground? If there's no friction and whatnot, like why do they end up on the ground at the same time? That kind of subject where there's plenty of misconceptions that just kids and even adults have in general about that subject. And it's been a really well-researched field in education. Like we know a lot about misconceptions in that particular field in the past, I guess, 40 years now. There's been a lot of research going on there. And there's a really good test that you can measure the level of misconceptions of students and adults, right? And so if you're able to impact that score, you basically know that your game not only taught something, but it basically shifted the way that they're viewing that particular subject. So it's more, I'm not sure how to say that, but it's more core. It is like misconceptions and changing intuitions of people, rather than like learning something by heart or something like that. And that has been kind of focus of my career, is like trying to focus on these things, because I don't know, to me at least, that's a big part of education, right? Is to change your worldview, if you will. And so, so the win there was basically creating a game that was very much a student game. It's not, as polished as what we're trying to do right now or anything like that. It was just kind of a proof of concept, but the outcome was really promising. And, it basically, if you look at the difference between players that were just playing the game or students that were just going through a regular class on internet and physics, right? The game was the big changer there. Basically, it had more impact than regular classrooms in there, which we know about. Like we know that listening to a professor talking about that subject is not the same as experiencing something, right? So, yeah. And so, I guess the big win there was finding a subject that lends itself well to that kind of learning through games, and then, learning about how to do these games there, right, about that. And so after that, for me at least, like it was like finding other subjects that were counterintuitive. So after that, we focus on fractions, which is also another kind of bottleneck in education, right, for mathematics. Mm-hmm. And I think basically the way I say educational games is that the games out there that are the best educational games, I would say, are just commercial games, right? So I would say something like SimCity for urban planning is a classic one. World of Warcraft, maybe if you want to manage your team, right, and learn how to work
team communication and
there's a lot, but conflict resolution, there's a lot going on in there, right? And I don't know, Scribble Knots for writing. And so basically, I think there's a lot of games out there that we can say are really great educational games, and that there's a lot of fields that are more like, on subjects that are more school related. So I mentioned Newtonian physics, fractions and whatnot. There's a lot of fields that would be compatible for games that just haven't been explored yet, right? And so there's been enough win to like know that, there's probably others, I guess, other fields that we can explore, right?
I'm sure, and I'm sure you will continue to do that. And talking about exploring new fields, if you were to face a new project, maybe we can even start by that. Like, how do you identify a new game that you want to create, and what happens after that? Like, what do you have some sort of process? What are the steps you go through when you're creating these educational games at Ululab?
Yeah, for sure. So the first one I mentioned a few times already, just finding the proper subject matter, right? And the very second step is trying to figure out the misconceptions in that field. And so research is not always there, basically. Like, we don't always know, right? So in Newton and physics, it was pretty easy. We had a list of misconceptions and, well-documented mistakes that they do all the time. Like, it's even down to the level of, like, here's a question, and then here are 4 answers, and 3 of these answers are the most likely mistakes you'll make, right? And so it's a really crazy test to take because it's been designed to make you fail, right? But basically, if you have something like that, it's great. If you don't, like, you try to figure out what are the misconceptions in that field, and once you have that list, it gives you, or at least for us, the way that we're approaching it, it gives us a roadmap of what we're going to try to tackle. And basically, our goal is that players will make these types of mistakes or misconceptions in our game, right? And so the very next stage after that, once you have identified these misconceptions, is to find game mechanics that players will use. And in the process of using these game mechanics, they'll make predictions. And so our typical type of game are more like reflective or puzzle games for that reason, right? We don't want any sort of time pressure or do as many of these problems in a given amount of time or anything like that. We want them to actually take their time, be relaxed, and look at the game and make a prediction. And we want that prediction to fail, basically, right? We want these players to try something out of their misconceptions on the subject and then realize themselves that they failed. And once they do that, there's, all sort of theory and education about it. But I guess it's called a cognitive conflict, right? So whenever they do that prediction and it fails, they're in a mindset that's more compatible to learning out of it. And so at that point, it's really crucial also to find ways to give good feedback. And so the other crucial part of a project is, do we have ways to give that feedback that will make it clear, right? And so do we have, for example, in mathematics, it would be, do we have good manipulatives to visually represent subject matter, right? If you're talking about fractions, obviously you want to use the area model and maybe other models as well, right? But ways to show it in a way that if you make a mistake, you'll see right away why you did something wrong, right? So that's the other part. And if we have all of these elements, typically we're able to do a game about it. So at that point, it just becomes regular game design of building levels somewhere halfway through the game and up to the end of the game to make sure that you have enough complexity in that game. And then you just build up the full series of levels and playtest a lot. There's a lot of playtest going in that process. But, from the moment that you've identified all of these things, I feel like the rest is just regular game development, if anything. Yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question or isn't. If you have questions about the process, yeah,
absolutely. That's the way that you guys approach things, and it's absolutely fantastic to have that sort of insight into your minds, into what it is that's happening at Ululab that's making all that magic happen.
Yeah, it takes a lot of time, that's for sure, but it's fun.
Cool. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. And Francois, what would you say is, given again this experience, this process that you have, all these things that have been happening for all these years, would you say that there's some sort of, let's call it best practice, something that, when creating these game-based learning solutions, maybe if you include that, it'll at least make it better?
Right. Well, I think I'll answer with the first thing that I do whenever I try an educational game out there. And I say educational, a game that's presented as an educational app or game. I always try to fail basically. First thing I can do in the game is just try the wrong answer or, do something that's obviously not intended or anything like that. And that's basically the first way that I judge these games in general, is if the only thing that the game does is telling me that I've failed, then it's a practice game. It's not really a learning game, right? Because if I don't know the subject already, kind of by definition, if you will, if I don't know the subject already, I need to be able to have tools in order to understand better the subject matter, right? And surprisingly, a lot of games fail this really simple test. They don't give you feedback and opportunities to learn, if anything. And so it was the case 13 years ago, but it still is the case, unfortunately, that most games out there or gamification apps or whatnot are mostly practice games, right? You know the answer already, but or you can deduce the answer by yourself and kind of reach your proper conclusions by yourself. And so being told just no, that's not a right answer is helpful for these games. But I would categorize them more as practice games. So what I would categorize as being learning games will tell you why you're wrong and will show you, right away why that is, or give you hints or something like that, right? And yeah, that goes to
because
maybe
otherwise you won't be able to figure it out yourself.
Yeah. So basically, just handle failure properly, I guess, is what I would say is like the thing that all games could benefit from. But really, like most actual games do that successfully. In my experience, at least, like successful games, make sure that you learn from your failure. But educational games fail to do that most often, which is interesting when you think about the vocation of these games, if anything, right?
Absolutely. And precisely like one of the things that we kind of gather from games when it's gamification or educational games is, the capacity that you have to fail and that it's okay, that you can learn from that and that you can do better once you try again.
Yeah, a lot of the game's potential is there for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. And as you know, you were, referred to or commented on by a previous guest of the podcast. I would like to know if somebody comes to your mind as well, like you're hearing these questions. You mentioned that you discovered the podcast recently as well. Does anybody come to mind that you would say, look, I would really like to listen to the insights of this person?
Yeah, that's so that one was challenging to answer for me because it turns out you've interviewed a lot of people. So I had a few people in mind who were already kind of interviewed. But yeah, I mean, there's a few, I'm going to say quote unquote competitors out there that are really interesting people in that field. Like I've spoken recently with Grant from CodeSpark. So they're doing an app on coding, and it's one of these learning games that I would consider as being actual learning games. And so yeah, and they maybe the thing that distinguished them the most, I think, out of like in that market is that they've been successful and been able to grow. They were recently acquired, but basically they have figured out not only the game design side of things, but also the business side of things, I feel like. And so, yeah, maybe for that reason as well, they're interesting to interview.
The name is CodeSpark?
CodeSpark, without an S at the end. Yeah.
Gotcha. We'll look it up. And in that same direction of recommendations, is there a book that you would recommend, an audience that is avid of, creating games, game-based learning, maybe even gamification? Like, is there something that comes to your mind that they would, benefit from reading? Yeah.
So this one, I'm going to stay really simple for a suggestion. It's a classic, but it's Ralph Koster's, Theory of Fun, right? But the reason why I mention it, do you know that book or?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So the reason why I mentioned this one in particular is because I feel like it's basically the main thing that this differentiates a practice versus learning games that I was talking about. And I feel like if you haven't read it already and you're more on the gamification side of things, there's good things to learn from it, right? If anything. But yeah, and having said that, I don't want to diss all gamification games or practice games or anything like that, right? There is absolutely a place for it, I think. But just the current market is skewed toward gamification/practice, right? And so I feel like this just benefits from reading that kind of material. And it's a good introductory material to that kind of mindset, right?
Absolutely. That's an absolutely great book. And I had never thought of it that way that you're mentioning, but it does tie in pretty well.
Yeah, I guess the main, not to spoil anything, but the main conclusion from the book is that the reason why we like gaming in general is because we learn through them, right? So, yeah.
Absolutely. And what would you say is, again, in this world of creating game-based learning, and as you said, there's quote-unquote competitors and there's all sorts of people doing different things. What would you say in your case? What is your superpower, that sweet spot, that thing that you do probably at least better than most other people out there?
Right. Right. I would say I don't know if I can say it's a superpower because it's really slow. So it's not like, snapping fingers and it happens. But it would be about finding game mechanics that work well with a given subject, right? Absolute
superpower for sure, especially in this industry.
Yeah, but it takes time, I guess, and it's not a magic bullet. So it's a hard thing to do. I feel like I've gained some experience in that field, but it still is hard.
Makes sense. It is definitely something to look forward to. And we come to a very difficult one, and hopefully we'll keep you away, at least for now. I'm sure there's plenty of your games which could be categorized as your favorite. But outside of the games that you created, what would you say is your favorite game?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And
educational or not?
Yeah, I was gonna ask if you had a preference for it. If it's not educational, I think I would go for RimWorld. Do you know that game or?
Grimworld. It rings a bell, but I haven't played it for sure.
It's a RIM, RIM.
RIM.
No. Yeah, It's a game created by a single person. It's more akin to basically Dwarf Fortress, if you know about that one, but it makes it really more approachable for everyone. And it's a game about managing a colony, but the game systems are so well designed in that game. So mostly I answered that question with this game because of the game design side of things. And I guess as a game designer, for me, this game is like not near perfect, but it does a lot of things right.
That sounds absolutely amazing. And every now and then, we do have some time left, after all these questions, and we bring in a random question from the audience. In this case, we have Terry Friedrichsen, he has an ESL/EFL background of 50 years and is interested in helping learners to use popular multiplayer games like Fortnite, PUBG, COD, Minecraft, etc., to improve their English. So he says that he and his son have been in the space for a while. They have built a website, a YouTube channel, etc. And he is interested in, if there are others in the space, doing this kind of thing. And of course, second, how to reach an audience of non-native learners in English. It's definitely not going to be an easy thing to do because they're not likely to have thought of learning English through video games necessarily. And, they do not necessarily search in English. So if you have any ideas around that, I think Terry would be very, very happy.
Right. Around how to reach out to these players? Or
I would say that's the core of it, because if there's others or not, I don't know how long ago this question came in. I'm sure there's others doing this kind of thing, like learning through video games, and there's even memes. I learned English, through video games and doing it better than whatever others. But
it actually is the first time I was exposed to English, I guess, was through Space Quest, which was really like a black and white game, but you interacted through words, right? And so you had to understand the language. So I totally understand where they're coming from. As far as it's just to make sure I properly understand the question, is it about reaching more players and kind of starting an organization around it, or is it more like for themselves, like finding players that would be interested to interact with them?
I understand it would be players to be interested in participating in their games and learning English through the game they are creating or have created.
Okay, getcha. Yeah, that's a really tough one. Like I would reach out to just organisms doing that typically, right? So like there are organisms kind of trying to teach English in various regions of the world. Like even here in Quebec, we have a few, right, that are focused on that. But yeah, I have to say, I'm not sure how I would, like, besides just going through the regular channels to learn that language and see if they're interested in trying a different approach, right? That would be my first intuition.
Given your background, it could be interesting as well. Like, you're teaching, for example, math or physics or those things. Do you go through regular schools or like how do you approach it? Because maybe that could be sort of a spin-off for.
Oh yeah, for sure.
For people.
Yeah, that's a good point actually. So I totally failed to mention the big part in game development for us, which is that we are working with university teachers, right? So my own background was to go and do a master's in education, but during that time I made a few contacts with the professors working there, and over time gained more, right? And they are really, really interested in measuring the impact of these types of games. And so and also these professors are typically well connected with schools. And so, if you need contacts, that's a great way to get there as well. But basically, if you have an approach that has potential and can lead to real measurable results, typically researchers are really excited about that. Like I'm not sure if you, being in that field, I'm sure you're aware of this already, but they are really interested to measure the impact, and that means adoption, at least by some people, right? And it gives you credibility after as well. So that approach has been really successful for us in the sense that they not only intervene at the evaluation side of things, but also during the design phase of it, right? So even to improve your own learning solution, the university professors have been just crucial for us. And then, after that, it takes years, but after they've evaluated the app and measured the impact in classrooms, with the game, without the game, all that, you do come out of it with good research results, right? And that has happened for us in the past for Size Fractions, which is the first app of Ululab, where they were able to measure, like, in 3 hours of playing, you were increasing a significant amount playing through. You basically were skipping one full grade in your understanding of fractions in primary school. And so now we're able to say that, right? Like we're able to use that and quote unquote market that way because the research has been done by independent parties. And so for all of these reasons, like, design, evaluation, but also contacts in schools, that has been a great way for us to just gain more visibility in that space, right? Going through universities. So yeah, I guess that would be a more sensible answer from me.
And these are the kind of things that sort of pop up in conversation. It's not just that you sort of had it in the back of your head, just ready to come out. Sometimes it's just by sort of discussing it that these things get to be, to come out to the light, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So good question.
So, Francois, is there any sort of final piece of advice you want to leave the engagers with? Of course, please let us know where we can find more about you, more about Ululab, what you're doing, how we can follow all that work before we say that, at least for now, it's game over.
Yeah. So I'll start with the easy part. How to reach me would be, most easy is probably LinkedIn. So just with my full name on LinkedIn. And then our company's website is Ululab, so ULULAB. And if you just want to find our games on the app stores, it's Slice Fractions and now Map Makers, which is a new subscription game that we've just recently put on the market. And it has like a lot more content. And so probably start with Map Makers. You can try it for free as well on the app store for 7 days. And so that's a great way to see kind of the approach that we're taking with mathematics. And yeah, I guess the thought I would leave with is that all games are educational, really is kind of what I'm looking at. And so it's really hard to classify games. I mentioned practice games, learning games, and whatnot, but just my general view is that all games teach you something, and it's just a matter of classifying what these games are actually teaching you, right? And so, yeah, we probably need better terminology.
Sort of the purpose of what you're learning, because it's the typical thing, like, they never, memorize the elements of the chemical table, but they would memorize how to mix potions out of 450 different things in a game. So
exactly. Yeah, so we just need better language around it, I guess, is what I'm saying. But I'm confident over time that future generations will have played games and will be able to classify that as well. So yeah, it'll improve itself.
Hopefully so. And again, thank you very much for being with us today, Francois. I know you have a tight schedule as well, plenty of stuff to do. Running a company is not an easy one, but, thank you for coming here and sharing your experience, your time, your knowledge, your insights into this game, educational games world. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, it is fantastic to have you here, and I hope you enjoyed this interview with Francois. And I'd like to know, how are you listening to this podcast? If you're doing it through any podcasting app, have you followed, subscribed, whatever it's called on that app, and also, of course, rate it and review the podcast? Please go ahead and do so. That way we can reach more engagers like you to achieve our mission of making learning amazing. And if you want the instructions, a couple of examples you will be able to find on professorgame.com/iTunes. And so remember, before you go on to your next mission, subscribe, follow, whatever that looks like. It is absolutely for free. Everything that we're asking you for here is absolutely for free. So subscribe, follow using your favorite podcast app, and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.